Welcome to the Socialist chat room. My name is Ricky and I'm joined once again by Popey and No Justice. Today we are going to be talking about COP26 and the climate crisis. So, over the past 2 weeks, we've obviously had COP26 in Glasgow, where a bunch of incredibly wise and intelligent people have been discussing how we all need to do X, Y, and Z to overcome the most challenging problem of our time, the climate crisis. Among these ever so wise people is Ursula von der Leyen, who flew 31 miles by private jet, because clearly she's never heard of taxis. And then there was Jeff Bezos, the man who recently took a joyride in space and released God knows how many tons of CO2 into the atmosphere in the process. Some people have suggested that we shower less in order to reduce our carbon footprint. A smarter person might suggest the most effective way of tackling the climate crisis would be to lock these rich people up, especially when you consider 50% of the world's flying emissions come from 1% of the population. The climate crisis is unquestionably the biggest threat that currently faces our species, and this lot are telling us that we need to throw a bucket of water onto the fire as the world burns. But don't worry, because the market is going to take care of the rest, apparently. And of course, there are still deniers out there arguing we don't really need to do anything at all, which is interesting considering the level of denial this requires. Would they, for example, deny CO2 has risen from 278 parts per million to 417 parts per million since the Industrial Revolution? Would they deny CO2 is a greenhouse gas? Because if they do not deny either of those points, which they can't, then they agree climate change is real. And they probably need to seek psychiatric help for their cognitive dissonance. So, who would like to go first today?
Well, I think in general, what we have just seen is a complete joke. It's farcical, the idea that we have huge amounts of... first of all, the hypocrisy is great, is grand, and that we have huge amounts of, air pollution happening from all of the air travel that's been used to gather all these people in the same place. Hundreds of people, loads of different delegations from loads of countries, all flying around the world to then, talk about the idea that we should do something about the climate crisis. Right? It's already pretty hypocritical. And then for these people to then come up on the stage and then essentially engage in a nationalist dick-waving contest in front of every single other country in the world, talking about how amazing their country is at finding such and such market solutions and plans that they have moving forward to tackle the climate crisis. Considering this has been something that's been, it's been known, the idea that we need to do something about what is happening to global temperatures, happening to the climate, but it's been known for 40 years at this point. It's old news. It's something that we've been continually having to try and drum into consecutive governments that something needs to be done. They've done nothing. For them to come to us now and say, well, we've got these targets in mind for net zero emissions by 2050, 2040, or whatever, and then say, well, we're just going to have to find some kind of innovative solution to the climate crisis. I'm just like, the only reason why they say that we need innovative solutions is because they understand and they know that the unfettered market dynamics physically cannot fix this issue. We have a global capitalist system that deliberately requires consumerism and explicit overproduction and overconsumption to be able to satisfy the desire for economic growth. This is incompatible with the change in usage that we need to do as a collective species throughout the planet to reduce emissions to the point at which we can, save ourselves from hitting the 2%, the 2-degree climate world, right? These are incompatible. So they have to be able to put forward platitudes and, essentially empty statements about what their theoretical plans are for the future, rather than taking a good hard look at the incentive structures that are in place within the global capitalist market system, and the way in which this is incongruous with the change that we need to see to create a better future to bequeath to ourselves and our children as well. Now, it is also incredibly hypocritical when they say that they understand that it's a big issue, when essentially for the last however many years, for decades, we've had climate change denial being, this incredibly huge and difficult, goalpost for us to be able to hurdle. Yet now we've gotten to the point where at least it's the general consensus is at least accepting of climate change. Their rhetoric is now shifted towards, oh well, we're so far done now. There's nothing we can do about it. When there's things that we can do right now with existing technologies to be able to mitigate this crisis, it just involves public spending. And unfortunately, under a neoliberal paradigm, public spending is completely frowned upon. We could have large infrastructure projects in this country and in other countries to be able to divest from the incessant use of air travel and of cars into changing that towards a more kind of public transport centered approach, investment in renewable energy. These are things that we can do right now to change. Why has it not been done in the last decade, the last 20 years, the last 30 years? Why have we consistently ignored the big issue at hand for such a long time when there has been explicit solutions that we could have implemented immediately and have not? So in my opinion, Greta Thunberg was right when she said that it is essentially just blah blah blah. There's no concrete ideas, no concrete policy, just a bunch of waffling, a bunch of platitudes to be able to placate the idea that these people are entirely the reason to which the problem that we have now has been exacerbated as far as it has done.
Yeah, spot on. Popey, would you like to comment?
Yeah, I mean, I just find it like I find the whole thing really disingenuous. I get that the world has to come together. They need to be seen to be doing something. I really don't believe that they're actually tackling this seriously in any way. I mean, the fact that some of the biggest delegations at COP26 were, some of the biggest fossil fuel users and producers, some of these like huge mega corporations. And, I get that you need to involve these corporations if you're going to reduce carbon emissions because they're some of the worst offenders. But the way you do that isn't just to invite them along and ask them what they plan to do about it. The way you do it is to regulate them, and they need regulating on a global scale, not just in individual countries. Because if we start putting really strict regulations in certain countries, they'll just go and do the worst offending in countries that don't enforce those. And previously, the way a lot of Western countries have approached this in the first place to reduce our emissions is to essentially export a lot of our carbon usage to other countries by getting them to produce some of our unclean energies, or getting them to produce some of the some of the consumables, some of the technologies that we all rely on, that we all want to consume. You just have those produced abroad, imported, and then you don't have to necessarily include the carbon emissions for the entirety of that within our figures. So you get to do what politicians love to do, which is essentially to manipulate statistics to make it look like what you want the public to view you as is what's happening, whereas that is not the case whatsoever. This kind of global commitment to net 50 by net zero by 2050. Sorry, I think there's over 100 countries signed up to that. It's really, again, quite a disingenuous thing. I think a lot of people don't understand what net zero is, but it sounds good. But that's just the idea that you're offsetting the amount of carbon emissions that you're creating by absorbing them, primarily through planting trees. And planting trees is great. I'm all for planting trees. But it's not going to completely fix the problem. For a start, trees take a long time to grow. We've been cutting down our rainforests around the world for the last 100 and odd years. We've absolutely devastated entire ecosystems that have been there for thousands of years. The idea that between now and 2050 we can regrow all these trees is just completely laughable. Apart from the fact that they're going to take a long, long time to grow, we need the space to do that. There's no concrete plan in place to do that. There's no global strategy towards it. And then you've got one of the biggest issues, which is as climate change gets worse, these big green foresty areas keep catching fire and burning. And when they do that, they release all of that captured carbon straight back into the atmosphere. Other ways of talking about, let's invest in green technologies. Well, what are these green technologies? Do they exist? No, they don't. In a lot of cases, it's this kind of idea that as long as we throw money at it, the market will solve the problem, which, is just been the Tories' approach to pretty much every problem that we've had in this country for a long, long time. And it's it's the neoliberal kind of mantra, the agenda. The invisible hand of the free market will take care of us. Well, I'm sorry, but that's a load of bollocks. And there's only one way that you're going to actually tackle this, and that is through a unified global effort. And the current global leaders, they're not up to the challenge. And even though that they might make these pledges now, that doesn't actually mean anything, because these people who are making these pledges, a lot of them are elected officials. And if somebody else comes along and gets elected in their place, there's absolutely nothing whatsoever to stop them from just U-turning. And we saw Donald Trump do that on a number of occasions on, like, big international agreements. So these pledges don't really mean anything at all.
Yep, I mean, I couldn't agree more with all of that, especially the point about the market. It's just absolutely absurd. I mean, if these people learn nothing, I just feel like we're banging our heads against a wall. One thing I will say is I think it's good to hear that Prince Charles was very keen on defeating the climate crisis. If only he and his family members were as keen to avoid getting on a plane as Prince Andrew is. But I don't know if you've heard, but there was quite a funny story. It was Camilla was appalled to hear about Joe Biden breaking wind at COP26. Apparently, this was like a huge story. That's the kind of bollocks the media's been reporting. It's quite amusing, but the little outburst kind of pales in comparison to what the US have done. They've released 397 million tons of CO2 into the atmosphere, which is about twice as much as China, which has a population 5 times bigger. It's important to consider that American wealth was not just built on slavery and imperialism, it was also built on climate destruction. America and other countries built their wealth with a process of industrialization, which they are now denying other countries. I think we should remember this the next time they criticize the current world leader in green technologies, which is China. The truth of the matter is Western nations owe poorer nations a great deal because they've taken far more than their fair share of the world's resources, and they've hugely damaged the climate and left other countries with nothing to show for it. You could easily make an argument for compensating these countries to a very high degree. At the very least, I think we need to be world leaders in tackling the problem that we created. So, you always hear people whining and saying, oh, well, but the other countries aren't doing X, Y, and Z. We need to be taking the lead on this. Britain and America are like the worst offenders historically. We need to take by far the biggest hit economically. After all, we'd only be sacrificing wealth that we would never have accrued if we'd been building our economies in a responsible and sustainable manner. The climate crisis, as far as I'm concerned, it must be the absolute number one priority for every nation. In every general election, it should be the first thing on a party's manifesto is what are they going to do about the climate crisis, because obviously preventing catastrophic changes, to me, it's even more important than defeating poverty, because if we don't do it, we might not have a habitable planet for much longer. And if you are one of the older, richer people who doesn't fancy sacrificing a bit of your wealth, then as far as I'm concerned, your selfishness is breathtaking, and history's not going to remember you kindly. I'll certainly be making sure that my children know not to forgive those who share that attitude. They're going to know who's to blame. As far as I'm concerned, we've been fucked over. We've inherited this, and we're pretty much helpless to do anything about it. Who would like to come in?
Yeah, one of the other narratives that's been circulating, well, particularly for the last 2 weeks, but for a lot longer before this, is this kind of focus on what we as individuals have to do in order to save the planet. So one of the big things that gets talked about is, everybody giving up meat or significantly reducing their meat intake, switching to a vegan diet, which will have a positive effect if people do that. Depending on the way you do it, some vegan foods are not sustainable at all, but a lot of them are much, much more sustainable than meat and dairy. I've been a vegan myself for 12 years, and as much as I like to hear that out there, I think it completely distracts from the bigger picture, really. By putting the focus on individual, which is, again, what neoliberal countries love to do. They love to focus everything on individual responsibility, what you as a person does, which is great, because then when people don't get on board, they can point to those people and go, oh, look, they're not getting on board. They're the reason we're going to fail. Well, I'm sorry. No, that's not the case at all. despite literally everything else that we've done to destroy this planet, since World War II, as a collective, this globe has detonated over 2,000 nukes on our own planet inside our only biosphere. And I'm sorry, but no amount of vegan eating and energy saving light bulbs and electric cars is going to undo the kind of catastrophic effect that's had on our natural environment and on our biosphere. And to quote the great late Sean Locke on this, he said, when I sit there with my energy saving light bulb and my bag for life in the face of all this, I feel like I've turned up to an earthquake with a dustpan and brush. And that's completely apt. That is exactly what it's like when you try and put the onus on the individual. How are you going to tackle a countrywide earthquake with a dustpan and brush? It's impossible.
Yeah, I was watching Chud Logic, and he was talking. I was looking up about the idea of a personal carbon footprint, which is something we're always told that we need to have a look at. Well, no, we need to look at the collective carbon footprint anyway, because it's all you'd see where it ends up coming from. The idea of a personal carbon footprint was actually originally coined in an advertising campaign by BP to try and divert attention away from the existence of the fossil fuel industry. Like, we're so consumed by hegemonic powers of these large corporations that they can essentially change the discourse to whatever they feel like, to be able to abscond themselves from any kind of action, or to have to share any of the blame for what's happening at this point. Like, you're absolutely right, Popey. It feels completely pointless having to scrape the last pieces of residual korma juice out of a Tupperware container when you think that Jeff Bezos blows up millions of dollars worth of rocket fuel to eat floaty skittles for 10 minutes. It's absurd when you think about it. There's so many things that require huge amounts of legislation, require, I said, not just on an individual country level, but on a global level. But, it'd be nice if there were some countries that were doing it. And I know there's some have got some good targets in mind, but as far as we're concerned, with the only individual political landscape we can have an impact on right now is the UK, for example. It'd be nice to have at least one government who actually puts any of these practices into place. Like, I did like Gordon Brown's idea of eco towns was good, but unfortunately, he got voted out too early to be able to see that dream through. But a change in the way in which a change in which way we plan cities and the way in which we plan urban development could drastically change the way in which the way in which countries and urban locations generate amounts of carbon and deal with pollution in general. You look at American suburbs, for example. You can't not drive. There's no public transport. There's no pavements, and there's no off license. There's no local shop. There is a big mall, the other end of the suburb, which you have to drive to when you will have to park at. It's completely ludicrous urban design, to be able to create a kind of a municipal structure that isn't incredibly pollutive.
Yeah, I mean, just getting back to what you were saying before, I personally just can't help thinking of the absurdity of market-based solutions when market forces created this mess in the first place. You just gave a perfect example right there. The US economy is basically built on oil consumption, which is exactly why things are set up the way that you've just described. A corporation is not going to prioritize the environment over profit just because you ask them really nicely to draw up a plan to reduce their carbon emissions. I mean, if that's our approach, then humanity truly is doomed. What should have been agreed at COP26 is a global Green New Deal, kind of something like Jeremy Corbyn was planning to do, but worldwide. While net zero carbon would be a step in the right direction, it would not be enough because we need to end our dependency on carbon. We need to just be looking at technologies to completely replace it. I don't understand, for example, why we're not just putting solar panels on every roof. And the target date of 2050 for achieving net zero carbon is far too far in the future. The numbers just don't add up. I mean, we should be looking at net zero, this decade, and then beyond that, we should be looking at, zero carbon, full stop, not just net zero, but, completely moving away from it. But of course, the politicians don't care about any of that because this was never about finding meaningful solutions. It was always just about grandstanding, blaming China, and placing the burden on you, rather than the 20 mega polluting companies which are behind 1/3 of the world's carbon emissions. Driving an electric car is not going to put a dent in that. And by the way, I'm not saying that we shouldn't do better on a personal level. I'm simply saying it's not going to be nearly enough.
You're absolutely right. In companies like ExxonMobil, there was a sting that was done in a recorded meeting where the ExxonMobil executives explicitly stated that they fueled climate change denial research and spent money on the denial, like climate change denial like media outlets and media essentially advertising with their own brand advertising for themselves, right? Then they explicitly said, well, we have a duty to generate profit for our shareholders. That's their fiduciary responsibility, otherwise the system completely fails. Like, unless we get to some crazy point of inflection where the whole population of the planet, or the vast majority of the population of the planet, literally won't consume fossil fuels or won't consume from a corporation unless they unless they are carbon neutral, the market is not going to work in that way. And I'm sorry, the time at which we have that generalized population consensus within the market is going to be far too late before everyone's dead. And you're saying, right, why, like solar panels on roofs? We could have done that. Literally, we could have just spent government funds doing that a decade ago, 15 years ago. This could have been a long-term infrastructure project that the new Labour government could have done, and they obviously didn't, because why would they? Because they didn't spend any public money. They just borrowed money from private finance from private finance. Like, it's like having to see people say, oh, we're at this cliff edge about what we can do. We were at a cliff edge ages ago. I mean, people have been telling you for ages, and they just refused to engage with it because, winning elections, gaining money from donors, or trying to be able to shift the burden upon the individual has been far more interesting to them than any kind of structural change or policy that could have ameliorated any of these issues.
You want to come in, Popey?
Yeah, sure. I've been following quite a bit of the discussion on this, and I've also been trying to pay attention to what some of the more right-wing news sources are saying about this, because I think it's a really important way to understand the general consensus and the general kind of public discussion and public zeitgeist on this issue. Because let's face it, the right-wing media pretty much control the narrative in the UK, at least. And there's a lot of stuff out there, but one thing I came across in particular that I found quite amusing was a video that GB News put on Twitter, I think yesterday, where they turned up to the massive protest that happened outside COP26, and they decided to do some turning point style gotcha journalism, where they go and ask interviewers questions and then they kind of edit out their answers, or they just try and make them look stupid. And I found the video quite amusing because it felt like I was watching something Alan Partridge would have put out. But among all this nonsense that they were doing and this attempt to belittle people and repeatedly scoffing at the idea that humanity might go extinct without offering any counter argument, by the way, it was just simply dismissed as a ludicrous concept. How could we possibly go extinct? But among that, they did actually throw in some facts, some statistics that I kind of wanted to address, because when they put it out there and you just listen to it at its face value, if you don't really look into it, it might sound quite convincing to the average person. And one of the things that they kept repeating was this idea that 90% of the world's economy has signed up to net zero in the last week by 2050. And if you look into this is essentially the pledge that 100 odd countries have made to reach net zero by 2050 and to cut their carbon emissions in half by 2030. But I did a bit of searching into this and a bit of looking into some of the details about what this actually entails. And a lot of this is protecting forests around the world that actually exist already, and also trying to reforest areas. So I looked into what was being done about this, and there was a pledge from 12 countries, each to put in $12 billion over the next 4 years to protect land and also to regrow forests. On top of this, so that's $144 billion coming from 12 countries. On top of that, $7.2 billion from private investors, presumably some of these mega corporations And, to kind of grandstand and say, oh, yeah, we're 90% of people have signed up to this. And then when you look at what actually concrete has been pledged, that's nothing. That's about 150 billion US dollars roughly. And I just wanted to put that into a bit of perspective, just to show just how little has actually been put into this. So in the UK last year, £35 billion was either not collected or avoided in tax or cheated out of us by fraud. So that equates to about 47.5 billion US dollars. So in other words, over 3 years, the UK will lose in tax revenue the total amount that has been pledged towards reforesting and protecting existing forests. Like, it is a complete drop in the ocean. It's absolutely nothing. And then if I look at the amount of money that we've spent on COVID, just in the UK alone, so we've spent £261 billion so far on COVID in the UK, because it's a major crisis and we're actually treating it like a crisis. So that's how much the UK alone has spent, which, if you kind of translate that into US dollars, is basically the UK has already spent 2.3 times the amount of money that the entire globe, including these private investors, have pledged to regrow forests. Like, how is that treating it like an emergency? It is a climate emergency. It is a bigger problem than the COVID pandemic, and the COVID pandemic is huge. But the relative global spending doesn't even touch what we've spent in the UK. It is just absolute nonsense. And then for the media to be celebrating COP6 as this historic, world-changing moment, I'm sorry, but it's a load of bollocks, and absolutely nobody wants to really look into it, get into the nitty-gritty, and they certainly don't want to pledge to what they actually need to do, which is to completely reorganize our economies. We need a huge global redistribution of wealth. That's what we need. And how much has been pledged to do that? Like I said, less than 150 billion US dollars, nothing at all.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a complete joke. I think you hit the nail on the head with basically those price comparisons added and the expenditure. I mean, the reality of the situation is world leaders basically had a choice between socialism and extinction, and they've chosen extinction because they decided it would be better for the economy. Climate inaction, as far as I'm concerned, is a crime against humanity. It's the biggest crime against humanity in our history. Quite literally, if you think about the worst monsters in our history, what they've done, it's nothing compared to what we're doing to the planet. Not only should meaningful targets be legally binding, but politicians and business leaders who fail to implement them should be imprisoned. If a weapon was creating the level of death and destruction comparable to what the climate crisis can potentially lead to, we'd have no problem understanding the seriousness of the crime. But because it's happening through climate mismanagement, it's almost like we accept it as being part of the natural order. But obviously there's nothing natural about this. One thing that people don't seem to appreciate is this will actually create an awful lot of refugees. We're not only talking about coastal cities ending up underwater, we're talking about 1/5 of the planet becoming too hot to be habitable. We're talking about droughts and famines and economic collapse, quite possibly warfare. Just think about how mad we get now when refugees arrive from the latest country that we just bombed. Now imagine how much worse things could get and how all of this is entirely preventable. If you really don't like refugees coming to your country, then you can bloody well stop creating them.
I think that talking point is one of the things that Greta Thunberg's been talking about for many years since she entered the public light. Really, one of the things that she consistently focuses on is that the climate crisis is going to hit some of the poorer countries first and hardest. It's already doing that, has been doing for some time, and the sheer scale of climate asylum seekers that we're going to see and climate refugees that we're going to see in the coming years is going to be like nothing that we've ever experienced. And like you say, people already complain about immigration, which is is a ridiculous complaint, but that is a completely separate subject. But essentially, this idea that things can just carry on as it is and we'll be fine. No, I'm sorry. People are going to be fleeing countries as they become uninhabitable and they're going to have to go somewhere else. The population's already climbing and climbing, of course, for 10 billion humans. And if we've got those 10 billion people living in 4/5 of the space that we currently occupy, it's just going to get harder, it's going to get worse, quality of life is going to decrease, and it's necessarily going to have to decrease. And unless we put in the plans that we need to now in order to prepare for this, which we're not doing, when this happens, life is just going to be nightmarish for so many people, especially those who are actually having to flee and try and settle somewhere and settle in countries that aren't going to want them, going to be hostile towards them, aren't going to put the support that they need. They're going to be victims first. And it's one of the reasons that Greta has consistently been telling people when they listen to her, which a lot of people don't, but if you actually listen to her, she's been trying to amplify the voices of the people who live in the countries that are already currently affected, which makes the kind of one of the common criticisms of her is that she's a privileged white girl and all these green technologies that she wants is just going to affect other countries and it's just going to make poorer people poorer. She's well aware of that, and she's been trying to draw attention to it for a long time. People don't want to hear it, and they certainly don't want to believe it.
Like, the thing is that there's so much global wealth extraction that's been taken from the global south and put into the imperial core at this point that I think we have a duty within the imperial core to release funds to change the kind of the global kind of trade routes and the kind of colonial projects that have been consistently part of the capitalist global economy for such a long time now. We have a duty to be able to ameliorate that as part of our climate plan. At the end of the day, the issue is that so many of these countries are essentially at the mercy of the IMF and of the World Bank. That it's difficult to say, well, how much money is it going to take, and how much money are countries within the imperial core willing to give up at the behest of their own internal projects as well, to be able to benefit the imperial periphery in such a way as to change their infrastructure enough to be able to not be reliant on these kind of neoliberal frameworks that force them to divest away from communitarian social projects that would give a higher quality of life to people who would theoretically be future climate refugees, right? It's very difficult to square that circle when so much of this is tied to the value chains of post-colonial capitalism. So that's something that definitely has to get done. The issue I have with Greta Thunberg is that she didn't mention the C word. She always refrains from mentioning the C word, and I think she makes all the right points, but she doesn't find the key issue at the heart of all of this, which is capitalism, which is capital markets, which is the commodity form, which is the necessity for infinite growth, which she recognises. She recognised in the speeches that she makes that infinite growth is this desire for infinite growth that every single country has to have and the global economy needs to be able to function. Is a core part of capitalism, and she doesn't mention it. She doesn't put that forward across, and that we get lost in the weeds of the secondary causes that come out of the primary cause, and then we lose sight of the idea that a huge change in the global mode of production has to happen for us to be able to realize the goals that we need to achieve to save the planet from complete destruction.
Yeah, it's an interesting point you make about Greta Thunberg never mentioned capitalism. I think the reason why she doesn't do that is because she doesn't just want to be dismissed out of hand by conservatives. But I mean, I completely agree with you. It's a conversation that needs to be had. I've noticed, for example, David Attenborough, when he's been speaking about climate change, he's basically been saying the same thing. He's essentially been saying that we need to switch to a socialist economy. And this is a guy who cried at Margaret Thatcher's funeral, but he just never says the word socialism and he never says the words capitalism. And it's really frustrating because that's literally central to the problem. Just wanted to point out that even if we hit our CO2 target, 70% of the world's coral reefs are going to die. And if we fail, 100% are going to die. And that is... that's a result of capitalism. We're causing this incredible level of destruction. What right do we have to destroy ecosystems like this, all for monetary gain? just because we don't want to manage our economies sensibly, just because we want to put everything into the hands of the market rather than actually behaving like grown-ups, taking control of our own destiny, our planet's destiny, and making sure that we're custodians of this planet, not just for ourselves, but for every other living organism on it as well. 15,000 scientists have declared a climate emergency, and you don't respond to an emergency 30 years from now. You do it immediately. You drop everything else. Boris Johnson, quite absurdly, he said we were 5-1 down at half time. And then, as far as I'm concerned, he proceeded to score a couple of own goals for good measure. For example, he's saying he will tell corporations to draw plans to reduce their carbon footprint, which sounds great. But he won't do anything to make them follow through on their plans, let alone ensure they will work. So it's basically a nothing plan. It's a non-plan. The very least that we need is robust opposition to hold the government to account on this. We're absolutely crying out for it. But what chance do we stand when even the opposition party in the UK is distancing itself from its own Green New Deal? It spent a couple of years drafting this amazing Green New Deal, and now it's going very quiet on it. It doesn't really want to go through on it. I think they're kind of on the same page as the Tories, who just want to leave everything to the hands of the market and just, pretend they're doing the right things and being responsible with the economy. It's like the time for that passed, the time for that passed 30 years ago. The most frustrating thing is, I think, a global Green New Deal wouldn't just be fantastic for the environment, but it could also be fantastic for job creation. Far from impoverishing us, it might actually stimulate economic activity, lift a lot of people out of poverty. Another thing is, we could be training a lot of people in new jobs. Imagine, having an economy based around jobs that you actually wanted to do, rather than just going to a job like I used to fucking work for a credit card company, and you feel like the scum of the earth and you feel miserable every time you're going to work. We could actually be creating worthwhile jobs for people. That's one of the most frustrating things. But even if none of this worked out that way, even if it wasn't great for the economy, even if it created more poverty, it would still be worthwhile doing, because quite simply, it is the only way. Unless you're saying, we're prepared to sacrifice our grandchildren in order to save a few quid now, then it is the only option we've got. Essentially, the asteroid that wiped out the dinosaurs is coming, and half measures are not going to stop it.
I completely agree, and I think I've spent a lot of years with a really, really, really bleak outlook of what the future holds from a climate perspective. And I think the future's still bleak, and we are on the cusp of an emergency. We're in the beginning of a mass extinction event, essentially. But for the first time ever in my life, I've seen a ray of light that I thought I'd never see, essentially. And this is going back to Greta Thunberg again, and what she's done and what she's created, essentially. And just 3 years ago in 2018, she started a protest on her own. She just sat outside the Parliament, outside her country, waiting for the elections every day for 3 weeks, holding up a sign and just handing out leaflets and basically talking to anybody who would listen to her. She did that on her own for a while. After a while, one of her teachers joined her, then an artist joined her. Then she caught the attention of local media. Then she caught the attention of national media. And then within a year's time, she was addressing the UN. Amazing thing to have done. But I think people focus on Greta and not the movement that she created. Now, this young woman essentially galvanized a huge portion of her generation when they were still in school, before they were at voting age, to become politically aware and politically active. Something that we couldn't have dreamed of in the past. One of the big issues we've always had in the UK, particularly when it comes to election, is like abysmally low turnout among young voters, which is one of the reasons the Conservatives have kept the grip on power for so long. But Greta's created this global movement wherein within 6 months of her starting, she had 2,200 strikes in 125 countries around the world, being organised and led by people her own age. Now, shortly after this time, a young girl of 15 came to my union branch and addressed our branch executive. And this young girl in a uniform turned up and spoke in such an eloquent way that completely blew all our socks off. And what this young girl had essentially done was, being inspired by Greta, decided that she was going to organise her own protest her own strike, and she'd gathered thousands of people her own age and got them all to agree to go on strike on this one particular day. And she turned up to our union to ask us as working adults to join the strike because she said, quite rightly, we have no vote, we have no voice, and as much as we can protest and make a statement, we don't actually matter at the moment. The politicians don't have to listen to us, but they'll listen to you. So she turned up to ask us to support a strike, which we did. And she gave me a leaflet, which I've kept because it reminds me that we've got this generation of young people who are politically active, and they're already organising within their own generation. And this generation are just coming of voting age now. And I think what a lot of the world don't realise is that this is happening around the world, and we're going to see a surge of young voters who are primarily concerned with the environment. And I don't think the mainstream media see it coming. I don't think our politicians see it coming. And even though it's not going to be a complete landslide, the fact that we're going to have such a chunk of people all with this agenda on their mind coming into, voting in our next general elections around the world, I think we're about to see a bit of a political shift. And I really, really, really hope that kind of energy and that kind of movement that started with one little girl sat outside Parliament actually translates into actual tangible votes where people will vote for the parties that have concrete policies on climate.
Hopefully concrete policies that will grow.
Hopefully. Yeah, I'm hopeful for the first time in my life about the climate because of this.
The thing is, I think. Oh god, sorry. I was going to say that I think that Generation Z, like the Zoomers, these guys have been blessed with having grown up essentially post the climate change debate. They've not grown up within the uncertainty that has been peddled by climate change denial media for such a long time, and they've also been blessed by being grown up in a world outside of old media as well. They've kind of grown up within the alternative media bubble, and they've been exposed to things that are outside of what the media hegemon has been able to put forward to them. Right? They've been able to learn ideas. They've been taught in school that climate change is real. That's a thing that they've been taught straight away, and they understand that issue straight from kind of base principles, which I think is a real boon for them. And I think it's not just about the climate. I think about in general kind of left-wing economic policies as well. I have a really good feeling about where things might moving forward. There was an article by Christian Niemetz, who's amusingly a German capitalist researcher, looking at doing opinion polls of millennials and Zoomers regarding their political and economic positions, and they're incredibly left-wing. And what he found was that it's basically essentially the fact that we've never lived through the boom years of capitalism. We never lived through kind of the social democratic consensus. We've only lived through the miserable neoliberal post-Thatcherite consensus. We've been essentially hit with market failure after market failure after market failure over and over and over again. That we have no faith in capitalism at all, and that's not going to go away. Like what would usually have expected with young people essentially gaining some amount of wealth and accruing personal wealth over time, that doesn't happen anymore, and we've not seen the generational shifts in political trend due to aging and wealth accrual that we used to see previously. So I have a feeling that once the last generation phases out, which clearly the current retirees, I think I've mentioned before on the podcast that these people are people who drive the Conservative vote, people whose explicit voting intention is kind of tied to the value of their house at this point, because they don't work, so any kind of Labour policy doesn't really affect them at all, because they have no interest they have no engagement, any material interest in the jobs market itself. These are all people who they only vote based on a couple of key principles, which the Conservatives are really good at kind of generating hubbub around and keeping them engaged in politics in that regard rather. So once we see that generation kind of, I hate to say die off, but kind of, I guess, leave the electorate. Let's be diplomatic about it. We're going to see a very large political sea change, and people are going to be angry. They're going to be angry, and they are angry right now. My friend Ed is a teacher, or he was a teacher up until very recently, talking about how when he looks at the attitudes of Zoomers, they're incredibly bitter, and rightly so. And there's this kind of pathological hatred of the boomer generation for bequeathing them a dead planet. And I think, I mean, you've got to imagine that lots of this is kind of manufactured consent on the part of right-wing media and the part of the whims of, again, the whims of capital, essentially engendering these opinions in a lot of the population, which I guess you can't really blame them for. But that doesn't make the bitterness go away. There's still, I mean, human nature, I guess, under kind of a liberal kind of sense, it really wants to have some kind of scapegoat. It's difficult to blame a system when you can blame an individual or a group of individuals that you see some kind of demographic. It's very easy to do that, and clearly, Gen Z and millennials, they understand that it is the voting and political ideology of the boomer generation and the kind of the older Gen Xers that has caused a lot of the political climate and the political catastrophe that we have today. So I share Popey's optimism for the future. I just think that it's probably going to be too late.
Yeah, I pretty much agree with everything both of you have said there. I think the change is well underway in terms of the demographics. You look at, for example, how the Green Party's surging. I don't think that's any coincidence. That's not just because of the failures of the Labour Party, or the failures of the Labour Party are clearly part of it. It is because people want to see meaningful action on this. And that's exactly why we've had this establishment capture of the Labour Party, because they know that there is this huge demographic change to the left. And if they let another left-wing Labour Party challenge the Tory Party again, they know that next time we may well win. And once you win, there's going to be no going back, because, as you said, the older Tory voters are going to be dying out. I don't want to sound so grim, but that is going to happen. The younger generations coming through are going to keep being left-wing. They're going to keep voting for these policies. So I think the change is well underway. I just think there's been so much damage to now. I can't see how we are going to address this, because the will just isn't there. We need political leaders now who are just going to say, we are going to deal with this no matter what it takes, no matter what it costs. We're essentially at a war. This is bigger than World War II. During World War II, we weren't going to be arguing about how much this is that was going to cost. We were literally fighting for our survival, and we recognized that, obviously, because we had an immediate threat. It's the same thing, but it's on an even bigger scale now, and it's not registering with the older generations because they're so heavily propagandized by the mainstream media, because a lot of them online, they're not receiving the information that we have. They've not had the education on this that younger people have had, and it's incredibly frustrating to see. They've been brainwashed and they don't know they've been brainwashed, and it's really difficult to kind of explain to a person that they've been brainwashed without greatly offending them. So you're kind of fighting a losing battle. But I mean, the simple fact of the matter is we need to tear up our current economic model to defeat this, but we are governed by extremists who do think the accumulation of capital comes before the preservation of human life. One positive, as Popey touched upon, is that people are rising up. We've had over 100 climate demonstrations in the UK. We've had many more around the world. Glasgow saw the largest protest since Stop the War in 2003. So the younger people are desperate, and older generations aren't listening. They're essentially dumping future pain onto us, 30 years down the line, to alleviate their own pain today. And it was a pain that they chose to cause. And even worse is they're cracking down on anybody who challenges them. For example, Aaron Bastani was talking on Twitter recently about how the police kettled a large number of protesters for hours on end for no reason, and then they threatened him with arrest when he questioned why. This was at the COP26 protests. The establishment essentially doesn't want to be questioned. It wants us to blindly accept whatever fate it decides for us, and it wants us to treat them like heroes for failing. The number of leaders who were patting themselves on the back at COP26 was vomit-inducing. If all of them are doing as brilliantly as they think they are, we would not actually be in this mess. Anyone else want to come in?
Well, that's just really doom-appealing, really, isn't it? And you just look at, like, the fact that we just kind of need a general political will, and we're just fighting against people who, for whether intentionally or not, are just too blinkered to only see in the very, very short term, and not thinking about other people, not thinking about the world they're bequeathing to their children. Oh, well, if I'm dead then like, what do I care? I don't think that's something people do intentionally, or some people do. They're cognizant of the fact they're doing it. But I think when a lot of people who are kind of disengaged from the political sphere in general, it's kind of subconsciously happens. Again, I think it's it's this kind of ongoing facet of the kind of neoliberal society we live in that people can only see, the people are pretty short-sighted, can only see so far within their own space and their own existence. And also, like, there's a philosophy tube video about climate grief, and she was talking about how it's difficult to comprehend something as big as the planet dying, because we don't think of the planet as an entity. We just think of it as an environment that we live in. We think of the individual bits and pieces we know what. We think about the ways in which we interact with it, but we don't think of it like a big system, essentially, in the same way that we don't think of capitalism as a big system, at least not within liberal society, right? So it's difficult to try and get people thinking outside of that, in that kind of individualist mindset, and that's one of our biggest challenges, I think.
I think what people need to understand as well is that the planet itself will shift, adapt, and change. It's us that are fucked, and all the other life on the planet as it is, essentially. The last time we saw such a huge global catastrophic change in the atmosphere was way, way, way back before there was any complex life on the planet whatsoever. And the change that occurred was basically a massive rise in the amount of oxygen in the atmosphere, which killed nearly all life on the planet at the time. But the planet was fine, evolution took over, and many, billions of years later, here we are. If this happens again, we're all fucked. The planet will continue. Life in some form will probably continue, but not in any way that we know it. And I think that one of the messages that we need to get out, and anybody who's got any sort of influence, who's aware of this problem, whether it's us talking to our comrades in our trade unions and to, our social media networks, basically we need to put the idea out there, I think, that there needs to be massive general strikes. I think the only way that we're going to stop this oligarchy of power that is the corporations and the politicians that are in their pockets, neoliberalism have done its best to crush people power, and they've done that through attacking and crushing the unions and taking the teeth away from us, and it's been largely successful, unfortunately. But how we got that power in the first place was through massive general strikes, and I think we need to do it again. And it's not just about withdrawing our labour this time; it is about bringing the economy to a standstill if we need to, and properly showing the people in charge that they can't just get away with it, and that they can't just continue the way they are, and that they can't hold us hostage. At the end of the day, they need to be afraid of us, because without us, the entire system that they've built and that they profit off and that they capitalize on depends entirely on us, and we're not going to stop it by just voting people in, because it's too late for that. And as great as it is that we've got this generation that are coming up that will vote this way, we need a general strike, and we need general strikes around the world. We need to bring this capitalist system down, and the way we need to do that is by stop letting it function. Yeah.
I mean, the problem that we have is even calling for a general strike, I understand, is illegal. If the unions just discuss it, they can be taken to court, etc. If you discuss it on social media, I think you can even have your social media accounts deleted. So it's like, how do you even organize such a thing, let alone, find the kind of political will among enough people to do it? Going back to what No Justice was saying before, I think essentially people have been programmed to think from election cycle to election cycle, and kind of certainly with the older generation, they just struggle to see more than 5 years ahead. But the reality of what we're facing is that, we've got a planet which is already warmed by 1.2 degrees centigrade. Our current trajectory will take us up 2 degrees centigrade by the end of the century, and we could well pass a tipping point that would take us thousands of years to reverse. The sad truth is humanity might not be around by the time the planet has self-healed. If we are around, it will not be, we're going to be looking at civilizational collapse potentially. If it, certainly in the worst case scenario, the billionaires seem to know this, which is why the likes of Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk are currently building spaceships to get themselves to Mars instead of just focusing on fixing this planet. They've got this extraordinary wealth. It's like, why the fuck are you building spaceships when you could actually be they could be the literal heroes of our time. They could go down in history as being the heroes that fucking solve the climate crisis and save the world. These dickheads would rather fly to space. It's just exasperating. I mean, I can only assume that cleaning up the environment doesn't sound as sexy as being a space cowboy. It feels like it's the world's most expensive dick sizing contest. And they are both losing, and the entire planet is losing.
Agreed, 100%.
Anyone else want to add anything to that?
Yeah, let's hope next time one of them blasts into space, they stay there.
We're coming up to an hour now, so if everybody has kind of said what they
Satirically
want
in
to
the
say
video game
tonight,
Minecraft, sorry. Just want to make sure we don't get banned.
you what?
Just want to make sure we don't get banned.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I think we'll just call it a night. If that's it.
Bro, no worries. Cheers for hanging out, guys. It's been a pleasure as always.
Cool.
Yeah,
Thank you,
enjoy the
guys.
conversation. 100%. You take care. Have a
Good
good
night.
evening.
Bye-bye.
Bye.